They say wild horses don't just show up at your doorstep, but that's exactly what happened. And not just any doorstep, an aging, half-forgotten ranch at the edge of Montana's pine wilderness. The kind of place that exists more in memory than reality, wrapped in wind and silence. It was the kind of morning where the fog hangs low, brushing the tops of prairie grass, and everything feels like it's holding its breath. Jack Brennan hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 days, not since returning from his father's funeral and trying to forget 13 years of war. His days were spent walking the fences of the broken ranch, listening to the creak of weathered wood and the occasional rustle of something moving in the brush. He'd come back home to escape the noise, but that morning the silence broke in the strangest way. It started with a sound, soft at first but deliberate, a single muffled crunch of hooves against frozen ground. Jack turned his head, expecting a deer or maybe one of the few half-starved horses still lingering on the property. But it wasn't. Just beyond the last line of fence, standing perfectly still in the haze, was a Mustang, alone, unmarked, untamed. Its coat was thick and matted in places, dark against the pale morning light, and its eyes, Jack never forgot the way those eyes looked at him. Not wild exactly, not afraid either. It stared straight through him like it was asking a question he didn't know how to answer. Jack stood frozen, one boot halfway into a stirrup, unsure whether to mount up or step back. The Mustang didn't move. It was almost as if the horse had appeared not by chance, but by intention. And maybe that's why Jack couldn't look away. There was something uncanny about the moment, like the old stories his father used to tell him about animals knowing things people couldn't. The kind of tales you'd scoff at as a grown man. But out there in that vast, breathless morning, with the sky just beginning to stretch open, Jack felt the weight of every superstition he'd ever heard. He found himself stepping closer without realizing it, not with any plan, not even with much curiosity, just following a pull in his gut that defied reason. The Mustang stayed perfectly still, head high, ears twitching. Jack called out, just a low, unsure, "Hey there," and was answered only by silence. Still, the horse didn't bolt, it just watched. Then, after a beat that stretched far too long, it turned. Not in a rush, not in fear, but with purpose. It walked back toward the tree line, glancing once over its shoulder, and Jack, who had survived IEDs, ambushes, sandstorms, and sleepless nights in hostile territory, felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. He should have let it go. He should have chalked it up to chance and gone back to fixing the broken fence or feeding the remaining horses. But instead, he saddled up. No hesitation, no logic, just instinct. Something about that horse, about the way it moved, the way it appeared out of nowhere, gnawed at his mind like a whisper half heard. He'd been trained to read signs, to follow movements, to trust his instincts when everything else failed. And every part of him screamed that this wasn't random. This wasn't just a wild Mustang wandering too close. This was something else. The moment his horse stepped off the property line and followed the trail into the trees, Jack knew. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what he was about to find, but he knew, deep in his bones, that whatever waited beyond the pines wasn't something he could walk away from. Not now, not after that look, not after the way the silence seemed to close in again behind him, as if the world was holding its breath all over again, waiting to see if he'd keep going. And he did. Because sometimes, when the world goes quiet and a wild horse looks you in the eye, you don't ask questions, you follow. The trees swallowed him. The second Jack passed beyond the last weather-beaten fence post, it felt like the sky dimmed a few shades and the air grew heavier. Not with danger exactly, but with weight. Like the forest had been waiting, pine needles softened the sound of his horse's hooves, muting everything except the slow, steady rhythm of breath, his and the animal's. The Mustang was just ahead, weaving effortlessly between the trees, never rushing, never lingering. It would trot ahead, pause at a bend in the trail, glance back to make sure Jack was still there, then continue on. No saddle, no halter, just raw muscle, grace, and intent. It wasn't just leading him, it was guiding him. Jack kept his eyes on the trail, but part of his mind wandered. He hadn't taken this route since he was a teenager, maybe younger. Back then, the forest had felt endless, magical even. His father used to call it the quiet cathedral, a place to listen when nothing made sense. But now it felt different, ancient, like time here moved slower or didn't move at all. Trees stretched impossibly high above him, their trunks thick with decades of growth, bark grooved like the rings of history themselves. The deeper he went, the more the world behind him seemed to dissolve, like the ranch, the wars, the funeral, all of it had never existed. All that mattered was this path. And the Mustang. At one point, the trail dipped low into a shallow ravine. Ferns grew thick here, tangled with underbrush that tried to tug at his boots. A squirrel darted across the trail, but the Mustang didn't flinch. It moved like it had walked this way 100 times. Maybe it had. The oddest part wasn't the horse's confidence, though. It was Jack's own. He should have felt more anxious, chasing a wild animal into the woods without a plan. But instead, something in his chest had gone strangely still. It was like following this Mustang made him forget to worry, like the part of his brain that calculated risk had finally gone quiet. He glanced up at the sky through the gaps in the branches and realized how much light they were losing. The sun had already slipped toward the western ridge, casting a golden glow that barely reached the forest floor. Shadows were growing longer, stretching across the trail like dark fingers. Jack didn't care. He'd spent nights in darker places. Besides, he wasn't alone. Eventually, the trail narrowed even more, twisting through a thicket of black spruce. Jack's horse moved slower here, ears flicking nervously, hooves hesitant against the uneven ground. Up ahead, the Mustang paused at a place where the trees opened just slightly, revealing what looked like the ghost of a trailhead. It wasn't a path in the usual sense, not something groomed or maintained. It was more like a memory, the ghost of wagon wheels maybe, or worn footsteps from decades past. Jack realized this section of forest hadn't seen regular travelers in a long, long time. He noticed old wooden posts buried in the brush, half rotted and swallowed by moss, perhaps once marking property lines or the remnants of a forgotten fence. The past lingered here, not in obvious ways, not in gravestones or monuments, but in the silence, in the smell of the soil, in the stillness of the trees that had grown up around secrets left undisturbed. Jack had seen places like this before, not in forests, but in cities shattered by war, places where history sank into the earth and waited for someone to remember it. Still, the Mustang pressed on. Another 30 minutes passed, though it felt like more. Jack had stopped checking his phone long ago. No bars, no GPS, just instinct and hoofbeats. And then, suddenly, the forest opened up. It wasn't dramatic. There was no clearing filled with sunlight or music from the heavens. It just opened. A gentle slope rolled down into a shallow basin, overgrown with grass and wild weeds that came up past Jack's boots. At the center, nearly hidden beneath a lean of overgrown ivy and time-battered branches, stood a cabin. Weathered, collapsing in places, but unmistakably man-made. Its roof sagged on one side, porch half caved in. Windows either boarded or shattered. Nature had been trying to take it back for years, but it was still standing. Jack didn't move at first. The Mustang had stopped just yards ahead, perfectly still, watching him, as if to say, "This is it." A shiver crept down his spine, not from fear but from recognition. He had never been here before, not in his memory, and yet something about the cabin struck a chord. Maybe it was the way it leaned, or the color of the wood, or the strange silence that hung around it like a breath held too long. But deep in his bones, Jack felt it. This place mattered. He dismounted, tying the reins loosely around a nearby stump. His horse huffed softly, clearly uneasy. Jack wasn't sure what he was about to walk into, but that didn't matter anymore. The Mustang had brought him here, through thickets and shadows, past forgotten borders and down trails that didn't exist on maps. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something else, something deeper. Maybe fate, maybe unfinished business. All he knew for certain was that the cabin wasn't empty, not in the way abandoned places usually are. There was something inside, something waiting. The first thing Jack noticed as he stepped closer to the cabin was the silence. Not just the ordinary hush of forest stillness, but an unnatural quiet, as if the air itself was holding back. No birds called from the branches, no insects buzzed in the weeds. Even the wind seemed to skirt the clearing, avoiding the sagging structure like it was something sacred or cursed. The Mustang remained at the edge, unmoving, its breath visible in the cooling air. It didn't follow. It didn't need to. Its part was done. Jack was alone now. He circled the front slowly, boots crunching through tangled grass and brittle leaves. The structure was more intact than he'd expected up close, though time had left deep marks. The wood was warped and grey with age, nails rusted to the color of dried blood. Ivy curled up one side like a slow, choking hand, and the remnants of a porch tilted under its own weight. One of the front steps had crumbled entirely, and yet, through all that decay, the door stood closed, firmly shut, though crooked on its hinges. That was the second thing he noticed. The door didn't hang open like most abandoned cabins he'd seen. It wasn't swinging in the breeze or half torn from its frame. It was shut, decidedly, almost deliberately. He hesitated with one hand near the doorknob. Something felt off, a pressure in the air, as if the woods themselves were pressing inward, urging caution. He leaned closer, listening. Nothing, not even the creak of settling wood, just silence. Then came the smell, faint at first, something musty, earthy, sour, the scent of rot that had settled into the walls over time, but beneath it, something else, a note of something metallic, a staleness that made his stomach knot. It reminded him too much of places he'd been during war, places where terrible things had happened long before he arrived. The knob didn't turn. Jack frowned, tried again. Jammed. Not broken, not loose. Jammed. Locked. That didn't make sense. Who would lock an abandoned cabin, especially one this deep into nowhere? He pressed his shoulder to the wood and gave a light shove. The door groaned in resistance, but it didn't give. He stepped back and checked the nearby window. Dirty, cracked, and fogged with years of grime. When he rubbed a sleeve against the glass, it smeared more than it cleared, but he could just make out the shadow of furniture inside. A chair, toppled. Something else slumped in the corner, too obscured to identify. He squinted. Was that movement? Jack's body stiffened before he consciously registered why. He'd seen something shift. Just slightly, a flicker of motion in the gloom. He stared, breath shallow, until he saw it again. Just a blur, like a ripple across stagnant water. His heartbeat ticked up. It wasn't an animal. It didn't feel like that. It felt human. He stepped back from the window, tension rising in his chest, and looked around for something he could use. Near the porch, half hidden under moss, was a broken branch thick as a baseball bat. He tested its weight, swung it once. Good enough. With a deep breath, he braced himself against the doorframe and rammed the makeshift club against the knob. Once, twice. The third strike cracked something. The fourth forced the latch inward with a sharp snap, and the door swung open an inch, just wide enough to let out a puff of air so foul it made him gag. The smell hit him like a wall. Decay, sweat, something else he couldn't name. A chemical tinge that clung to the back of his throat. He yanked his shirt collar up over his nose and pushed the door wider. It scraped across the warped floorboards, revealing a dim interior cloaked in dust and shadow. Light from the clearing filtered through a shattered rear window, casting fractured beams across the room. Jack stepped inside slowly, muscles tight, instincts on high alert. The room was small, walls lined with warped wood panels that had long since given up trying to keep out the cold. Furniture lay scattered, an overturned chair, a broken table, shelves splintered under the weight of time. Cobwebs stretched across the ceiling in thick swaths, swaying gently in the disturbed air. And yet, something was off. The disorder didn't feel accidental. It felt like a struggle had happened. the kind where someone fights not just against another person, but against the walls themselves, trying to claw their way out of something unseen. And then he heard it, a sound so soft it could have been imagined, but he didn't. A breath, a shift of weight, the faintest creak from deeper inside the cabin. He froze, his ears tuned in, heart pounding in his ears, eyes scanning the hallway that branched off to the left. The light didn't reach that far. He pulled a flashlight from his jacket pocket, thumbed it on. The beam cut through the gloom, catching dust like snow in a storm. He stepped forward, careful to avoid the rotten sections of floor, boots creaking against boards that felt one breath from collapse. The hallway was narrow, suffocating. Walls lined with peeling wallpaper that may have once been floral, but now looked like dried bloodstains in the dim light. Picture frames hung crookedly on the walls, most with shattered glass or faded images. He passed one that held a photo of a man and a young girl standing in front of this very cabin. They looked happy. Once. The girl had her arm wrapped around a dog. The man's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Jack lingered for only a moment before the sound came again, from behind a closed door at the end of the hall. He approached slowly, flashlight trembling in his grip. The door was warped, its paint peeling in ribbons. The smell was stronger here. He reached out, tried the handle, locked. Another breath from the other side. A faint rustle. Jack pressed his ear to the door. Nothing. Then another creak, the kind of sound a person makes when they shift their weight but don't want to be noticed. He stepped back, scanned the floor, found a piece of broken chair leg nearby, gripped it tight. One hit, nothing. Two hits. The frame groaned. Third hit, crack. The door flew inward, splinters flying, the light piercing into a room without windows, where shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. Curled in a heap on the floor, pale and still, was a woman, hair tangled, skin sallow, her limbs twisted under her as if she'd collapsed mid-crawl. For a heartbeat, Jack thought she was dead. He rushed forward, falling to his knees, reaching for her neck. Her skin was cold, but there, a pulse, weak, shallow, but present. He dropped the chair leg, whispered something, anything, not even sure what. Her lips moved slightly, maybe a moan, maybe a whisper of breath. His training took over. He checked her vitals, scanning for injuries, bruises, dirt, dehydration. The air was thick with mildew and something else, urine maybe. She'd been here for days, maybe longer. Jack gently lifted her, arms cradling her limp body, eyes wide with questions. How had she ended up here? Why hadn't anyone come? Who had locked her in? He backed out into the hallway, every step urgent now. The weight in his arms, not just a person, but a mystery he couldn't begin to solve. Behind him, the room remained still. But Jack knew, as sure as the breath in his lungs, that whatever had brought that Mustang to his ranch wasn't luck. It was a message, a cry for help, and somehow, impossibly, it had found its way to him. Jack carried her like he had once carried wounded men through sandstorms and gunfire. But this was different. The weight in his arms didn't feel like that of a casualty. It felt like the weight of fate itself. She was slight, barely over 100 pounds, but every step he took toward the open cabin door felt heavier than the last. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breath coming in short, weak bursts, like a candle guttering in the wind. He didn't know her name. He didn't know how long she'd been locked in that suffocating room, what she'd eaten, if anything, or how she'd survived in that cold blackness. But what he did know, what he felt with every fiber of his being, was that if he hadn't come when he did, she wouldn't have survived the night. The air outside hit him like a wave of light and clarity, the cold air shocking after the stifling rot of the cabin. He blinked against the brightness, the sky now streaked with the dying light of dusk. Solace, the Mustang, was standing only feet away, its stance alert, ears pinned forward, nostrils flared, as though it too sensed the urgency of the moment. The horse didn't move, but stared at Jack and the woman in his arms with an intensity that was hard to explain, almost as if it were taking stock of them both, waiting for a signal that everything was going to be okay. Jack laid her down gently in the softest patch of grass he could find just outside the porch, pulling off his jacket and folding it into a makeshift pillow. Her eyes fluttered behind her lids. A low moan slipped past her lips. He crouched beside her, one hand brushing hair from her face, the other reaching into his coat for the bottle of water he kept tucked there. Uncapping it with one hand, he poured a few drops between her cracked lips. She swallowed, barely, but it was enough. Enough to prove she was fighting, enough to give him hope. Jack checked her pulse again, still thready, still slow, but steady. She was holding on. He fumbled with his phone, praying for reception. The screen lit up, no bars. He swore under his breath and held it higher, angling toward the treetops like it might matter. Still nothing. He stood, searching for a break in the trees, a spot where the sky peeked through enough to bounce a signal down. After walking several yards away, waving the phone like a lunatic, a single flicker of a bar appeared, then vanished, then came back. He punched in 911 before it disappeared again. The phone rang once, twice, then a crackle of sound. A dispatcher answered, staticky, hard to hear, but real. Jack gave them what he could. No street address, just landmarks. An old cabin might have been called Whitmore Ranch, about 5 miles west of Lone Ridge. Follow the old Forest Service trail if it still exists. There's a woman, she's alive but barely, locked in a room. I don't know how long. The dispatcher's voice crackled in and out, then steadied long enough to assure him that help was on the way. He ended the call, uncertain if they'd find the place before night fell completely. He didn't trust the trail to be easy to follow, not in the dark, not with this kind of terrain, but at least someone knew. He turned back and knelt beside her again. Her breathing had evened slightly, her face no longer as pale. He dribbled more water into her mouth, careful not to choke her, and she responded with a soft sound, almost like a sigh. Jack kept talking to her in a low voice, more for her sake than his, telling her she was safe now, telling her to hang on, telling her a horse had found her and wouldn't let her be forgotten. Solace stood nearby, unmoving, a sentinel. Jack couldn't help but glance at the horse every few moments, wondering how in the world any of this made sense. The wild Mustang, the locked room, the girl on the edge of life. It was like something out of a fever dream or a campfire legend, but this was real, and he couldn't shake the thought that he hadn't found her by accident, that somehow this horse had known, that it had come to him not for help, but with a mission. Time passed slowly. He kept her warm, tucking a spare flannel around her that he found in his saddlebag. Occasionally she stirred. Her eyes would flutter, lips part, but no real words came out. He'd say her name, though he didn't know it, and talk to her like he'd talk to someone drifting on the edge of sleep, coaxing her back with reassurance. And every few minutes he checked her vitals again. They were holding. Barely, but holding. Finally, long after the last light had bled from the sky, he heard it. A distant rumble, tires against rough trail, the faint, echoing cry of a siren. He stood, heart pounding, waving the flashlight in wide arcs. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees. A pair of vehicles, an ambulance and a sheriff's SUV, bounced their way into the clearing, tires crunching dry leaves and roots. Medics jumped out first, moving fast and calm. They descended on the girl, their equipment clicking open like clockwork. 4 lines, oxygen masks, murmured commands. Jack stepped back, letting them work, his adrenaline finally beginning to burn off. A female medic looked up at him and nodded once. "She's alive, weak, but she'll make it." Jack felt the tension in his spine release all at once. His knees buckled, but he stayed upright. The sheriff approached him, a young deputy whose badge read Carson. He asked for details. Jack gave him what he could: the horse, the trail, the cabin, the door that was locked from the outside. Carson's brow furrowed. "Locked from the outside?" he repeated. "You're sure?" Jack nodded. "I had to break it in." The deputy glanced toward the cabin, then toward the Mustang, which was still standing just beyond the ambulance, tail flicking slowly, eyes fixed on the scene like it was taking inventory. Carson blinked. "You saying that horse led you here?" Jack nodded again, slower this time. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Carson didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just looked at the horse a little longer, then turned back to his notepad, scribbling something down. A few minutes later, the medics had the girl stabilized and loaded onto the stretcher. Her face looked softer, less drawn. Color was returning to her cheeks. One of them called back, asking Jack her name. "I don't know," he replied. "She hasn't woken up, but—" He paused, then remembered. Around her neck had been a necklace, delicate, tarnished, with a name etched into it. "Sage," he said. It said Sage Whitmore. They nodded, closed the doors. The siren picked up again. And then she was gone, taken back through the forest, back toward safety, toward answers. Jack stood in the quiet that followed, every part of him buzzing with leftover adrenaline. Solace walked to him then, unhurried. The Mustang lowered its head, pressing gently against his shoulder. Jack rested a hand on the horse's neck, eyes still on the trail where the ambulance had disappeared. "You found her," he said softly. "You saved her." The wind stirred through the trees again, and for the first time in hours, the birds returned. A soft call echoed in the pines. Jack looked at the broken cabin, its door hanging askew, the secrets inside still unanswered. But one thing was clear. Whatever had brought solace to him, whatever force had moved through this forest, it had changed everything. The forest was quiet again. The red and blue lights had vanished down the trail, swallowed by distance and darkness, and with them the noise, the urgency, the organized chaos of rescue. All that remained was the aftermath, an eerie, lingering stillness that settled like fog over the clearing. Jack stood where the ambulance had been moments ago, his boots half buried in cold grass, heart still beating out the echo of adrenaline. The last words of the paramedic echoed in his ears. "She's stable, but not out of the woods yet." The implication was clear. They got her out just in time. Maybe seconds counted. Maybe the difference between life and death had come down to a single step. He took off the ranch, a single glance toward a wild horse that refused to run. He turned slowly, surveying the scene like a soldier scanning a battlefield once the gunfire has ceased. The cabin loomed behind him, a black shape against the tree line, its broken door flapping gently in the breeze. It looked older now, smaller, less like a mystery, and more like the husk of something that had been used and discarded, hiding its secrets in plain sight. Jack could still smell the rot on his jacket, the musty death clinging to his sleeves like a warning. But outside, under the open sky, it didn't seem as suffocating. The open air was a balm, clean, cold, and grounding. Solace stepped closer, the Mustang's hooves soft against the earth, mane shifting with the wind. The horse had never strayed far, never wandered back into the forest, or galloped away like Jack half expected it would the moment help arrived. Instead, it lingered, circling, watching, a sentinel in the dark. Jack turned to it now, meeting the animal's gaze. There was no fear in those dark eyes, only something that felt like understanding, something deep and quiet, something ancient. He reached out and ran a hand down its neck, fingers brushing through the coarse tangles of its mane. Solace let out a slow breath, warm against the night air. Jack exhaled too, for the first time in what felt like hours. The ride back was slower. Jack led his saddle horse on foot, one hand loosely holding the reins, the other keeping pace with Solace, who trailed him at a respectful distance like it had chosen to follow, not because of instinct, but because it wanted to. The forest had changed in the time since he'd entered. Every tree, every shadow felt heavier. Not in a threatening way, but in the way that old places feel once you've learned their stories. The trail seemed shorter now, but harder too. His legs ached. His arms were tired from holding her. His mind buzzed with 1,000 questions that had no answers. He kept thinking about her face, Sage. He hadn't even known her name until he saw the necklace, that small silver piece nestled against her collarbone. The engraved letters faded, but still legible. Sage Whitmore. It had sounded familiar in the way old family names sometimes do, the kind you hear whispered in town once and forget until they find their way back to you. Whitmore, the same name etched on the rotting sign above the door of that cabin. The same cabin that had swallowed her whole until a wild Mustang dragged Jack back into its orbit. Back at the ranch, the sky had opened wide again. Stars blinked in a black ocean above. The house sat like a dark ship against the sea of prairie, and the air was colder now, sharper. Jack unsaddled his horse, led it into the old barn, and gave it water before turning to Solace. The Mustang stood at the edge of the fence line, unmoving. Jack didn't tether it. He didn't try to lead it in. Instead, he opened the gate and let it stay as it pleased. Solace didn't run. It stepped forward once, paused, then settled into a patch of bare dirt under a cottonwood tree, like it was home, like it belonged. Jack entered the house, but sleep never came. He sat by the wood stove, watching the embers burn low, the crackling fire giving off more comfort than heat. His hands still bore traces of dirt, his knuckles scraped raw, his arms sore from carrying her. The silence pressed in, thick and unrelenting. He thought about her eyes, closed, fluttering, her lips parched and pale, the way she'd responded to water, the slow, stubborn beat of life refusing to give in, and most of all, the smell of that cabin, that locked door, the weight of something unsaid. At dawn, he walked the fence line, not for chores, not for routine, but to think. His boots crunched over frost-covered grass, breath visible in the cold air. Solace followed at a distance, quiet and watchful. And as Jack walked, one truth settled in his chest like a stone. He hadn't just stumbled across something strange. He had been led, pulled from isolation, from grief, from the numbing fog of survival. That horse hadn't wandered by accident. That trail wasn't random. That door hadn't waited for just anyone to break it down. He paused at the highest point of the pasture, looking out across the treetops in the distance. Somewhere beyond them, a woman named Sage was lying in a hospital bed, recovering. Alive because of a moment he couldn't explain. A connection between man and beast that had defied reason, defied logic, and led him to a locked room in a forgotten cabin. Jack had no idea who Sage Whitmore really was, or what had driven her to that place, or why no one had come for her. But he knew one thing with complete certainty: she had been meant to be found, and somehow, against every odd, she had been. Not because he went looking, but because something, someone, led him there. And now that the dust had settled, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. 3 days passed before the hospital called. Jack was out by the barn when his phone buzzed against his thigh, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. He answered, already knowing, somehow, that it had to do with her. The voice on the other end was a nurse, professional but kind, letting him know that Sage Whitmore had regained consciousness, that her vitals were stable, and that she had asked, softly, carefully, between sips of water, if the man who found her was still nearby. Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped the feed bucket where it stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and told the nurse he'd be there within the hour. He didn't know why the urgency hit him so hard. Maybe it was the unfinished edge to everything, the fact that she still had no voice in the story that had dragged them both into something deeper than coincidence. The drive into Lone Ridge was quiet, the road curling through pine and prairie in a way that felt almost symbolic now. The sky overhead was pale blue, streaked with high wisps of cloud, and the sun sat low enough to cast long shadows across the hills. The hospital was small, a single-story structure built decades ago and held together more by habit than modern design. Inside, the hallways smelled like antiseptic and lavender soap. The nurse at the front desk recognized him on sight. "Room 12, she said with a smile. "She's been asking about you since breakfast." He knocked once on the doorframe before stepping in. The room was quiet, sunlight slanting across a bedside tray holding a cup of tea, a few tissues, and a small vase with wildflowers someone had likely picked from the roadside. Sage sat up in the hospital bed, thinner than he remembered, her skin still pale but no longer waxen. There was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there in the forest, a clarity that made her look like someone who had stared into something dark and come back with her own light. "You're the one," she said softly, a faint smile pulling at her lips. "The one who carried me out." Jack nodded once, unsure what to say. There was so much between them now, not in words, but in experience. He stepped closer, taking the seat by her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got dragged backwards through time and dropped in a forgotten memory," she said, voice still hoarse. "But better, alive, thanks to you." She looked down for a moment, picking at the edge of her blanket. "And the horse?" Jack chuckled once, almost in disbelief. "Yeah, Solace." He said the name without thinking. She tilted her head. "You named it?" "Kind of named itself, I guess. That horse led me straight to you. I didn't know your name. Didn't know anything, but it wouldn't let me turn back." She fell quiet at that. He could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, not in fear, but in calculation, as if she were reassembling a puzzle with pieces that had been scattered for years. "That cabin," she said finally. "It belonged to my family, my grandparents. Whitmore was my father's last name, before he changed it to something less traceable." Jack leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, listening. "I came here looking for something. After he died, I found old letters, ones he kept hidden. They talked about Montana, about a place he'd sworn never to return to. I thought maybe if I came, I'd find answers. I didn't expect to get stuck." "How did it happen?" Jack asked. "The door. It was locked from the outside." Her face paled slightly. "I don't know. I walked in, started digging through drawers, old books. There was a storm coming. Wind slammed the door behind me, and when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The latch was jammed or rusted, or maybe—" She trailed off, her throat tightening. "I was shouting, pounding, but there's no one out there, no one around for miles." Jack nodded. "I only found the place because of Solace." Sage studied him for a long moment. "And you think the horse meant to bring you?" "I know it sounds insane," he said, "but I've worked with animals most of my life, and this one didn't act like any wild horse I've ever seen. It waited for me, made sure I was following, never ran off. And when I found the cabin, it stopped at the edge like it knew something was inside." There was silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with meaning. She reached for the cup on her tray, sipped, then set it down. "My father never talked about them," she said after a while. "Said they were broken people, controlling, cold. That ranch was where all his worst memories lived. I think he tried to cut it out of his life completely. But part of him couldn't let go. That's why I came. I thought maybe if I understood them, I'd understand him." Jack glanced out the window, his voice low. "I know what that's like. My dad passed not long ago, too. Left behind more questions than answers. Sometimes it feels like the dead leave us these puzzle pieces on purpose." Sage smiled faintly. "Then maybe we're both trying to solve something they never could." She reached over to her side table, fumbled for a notebook. "Before I blacked out, I'd started writing down what I found. Names, dates, some old land documents, letters. I need to go back. There might be more. I have to know why he ran and what he left behind." Jack felt a slow tension build in his chest. The thought of that cabin again, its shadows, its secrets, wasn't something he welcomed, but he also knew she couldn't do it alone. "When you're stronger," he said, "I'll take you. We'll go together, and we'll find what you're looking for." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "You don't even know me." "No," he replied, "but I know what it means to carry questions too long, and I think Solace brought me out there for a reason, not just to save your life, but maybe to help you finish what you started." Sage reached out then, her fingers brushing his. A simple touch, light as air, but it carried weight, gratitude, trust, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened and what was still unfolding. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, casting flickering shadows across the hospital room walls. Somewhere beyond them, the forest waited, the cabin waited, and Solace, wild and quiet and patient, was likely still watching from the edge of the ranch. Some connections don't need words. Some bonds are forged not in conversation, but in survival. And as Jack sat beside the woman he had pulled from darkness, both of them connected by ghosts, regrets, and a horse that shouldn't have known any better, he felt it in his chest. Something was beginning. Something that neither of them could walk away from now. Jack didn't sleep the night before returning to the cabin. Not really. He laid in bed with his arms behind his head, staring at the ceiling as moonlight crawled across the wooden beams and shadows bent with the movement of trees outside. He thought of Sage, her voice soft but steady, her determination clear despite the fading bruises and the ache still visible in her movements. She had a mission now, not just to recover, but to understand, and Jack, against all logic, felt himself caught up in it too. He hadn't planned to care. When he first returned home from deployment, he had every intention of disappearing into the rhythm of hard work and empty silence. But something had shifted. The weight of the unanswered had found its way into his chest, the kind of weight that didn't go away until you dug it up and faced whatever was buried underneath. When the sun broke over the edge of the prairie, Jack was already saddling his horse. He packed lightly, a flashlight, rope, water, and a basic first aid kit, then whistled once. Solace lifted its head from the far end of the pasture and began to approach, hooves crunching frost-covered grass with a slow, purposeful rhythm. The horse didn't resist when Jack clipped a halter loosely around its head. It didn't even blink as it stepped into the trailer, calm as if it knew exactly where they were going. And maybe it did. Maybe Solace remembered that trail better than Jack ever could. By mid-morning, the forest had swallowed them again. The way back felt different now, less like a mystery and more like a quiet reckoning. Jack knew the turns, the curves of the path, the way the light shifted through the trees. Solace followed him with a steady gait, sometimes pausing to glance toward the brush as if scanning for movement, but never straying too far. Jack walked ahead of both horses, boots pressing into earth still damp from a recent rain, mind occupied by what he might find. When they reached the clearing, the cabin stood just as they had left it, slumped into itself, cloaked in vines and silence. The broken door hung from the frame, cracked along the edges from where Jack had forced it open. The air smelled different this time, less like rot, more like something simply forgotten, the dust of time rather than the presence of death. Jack dismounted, looped his horse's reins over a low branch, and turned to Solace. The Mustang stood at the edge of the tree line, watching, always watching. Jack didn't expect it to follow him in. Some things even animals didn't want to cross. Still, he gave the horse a small nod. "Stay close," he said under his breath, "just in case." Inside, the cabin felt colder. The light barely filtered through the boarded windows and cracks in the walls. Jack flicked on his flashlight and scanned the room, his boots crunching on leaves and shattered debris. The hallway still led to the back, to the room where he had found Sage, its door broken in, hinges dangling uselessly. But Jack wasn't interested in what he had already seen. He wanted the parts still hidden. He started in the main room, brushing aside collapsed furniture and lifting warped floorboards where possible. Dust choked the air, and more than once he had to pause, step outside, and breathe in the clean forest air before continuing. He worked methodically, careful not to disturb the structure too much. The place was old, dangerously so, and the last thing he needed was to fall through rotten wood into some hidden pit. But still, he searched. After nearly an hour of turning up nothing but rusted nails and fragments of broken glass, he spotted something different near the back wall. A faint square outline above the fireplace, barely visible, but there. A crawl space? Maybe an attic. The outline had been hidden by a collapsed bookshelf, now mostly dust and wood pulp. But Jack could see it now, a panel, slightly recessed, with a tiny ring screwed into the wood. He moved a chair underneath it, bracing his weight carefully as he reached up and tugged. The panel creaked, reluctant. A puff of old insulation drifted down like snow. But it opened. He hoisted himself up into the crawl space, flashlight clenched between his teeth, shoulders scraping against beams as he maneuvered into the tight darkness. The air was dry and stale, filled with the scent of mouse droppings and old paper. He moved slowly, sweeping the flashlight over piles of crumbled boxes, disintegrated fabric, and finally, one intact object shoved into the far corner. A wooden crate, dust-covered, weather-worn, but whole. He dragged it toward him and pried the lid open. Inside were layers of paper, envelopes, files, yellowed letters tied with brittle string. The top letter was addressed to Mother and Father, the handwriting looping and elegant, dated June 1973. Another was stamped from a law office, referencing inheritance disputes and land titles. Beneath it, a folded document bore the Whitmore family crest, and near the bottom, a torn letter, jagged across the top, the only legible words reading, "I'm sorry, I never meant for it to happen like this." Jack sat back on his heels, breath catching. He didn't know what Sage had expected to find. But this felt like the beginning of something big. A story buried in silence, a decision that had split a family apart, and maybe, just maybe, the explanation for why her father had cut ties so violently and never looked back. He tucked the letters into his backpack, careful not to bend them, and began the slow crawl back down. As he dropped to the floor, the wood creaked ominously beneath him, and then it gave way. Jack's leg shot through the rotten plank, pain flaring as his shin scraped against some sharp beam below. He landed awkwardly, clutching the backpack to his chest to protect it, teeth gritted against the impact. Dust exploded in the air, stinging his eyes. He cursed, checked his leg, bruised, maybe cut, but not broken. From outside came a sudden, sharp whinny. Solace. Jack could hear hooves striking the porch. The horse was agitated, pacing. He groaned and pulled himself free, limping toward the front room just as the Mustang appeared in the doorway, nostrils flaring, eyes wide. Jack waved him off. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Just got too close to the edge." He stepped into the sunlight, sweat clinging to his back, and sank down on the cabin's crumbling porch steps. Solace approached, nudging him once with its muzzle as if checking for injury. Jack laughed under his breath and ran a hand along the Mustang's neck. "We got it," he said. "We found what she was looking for." In his backpack, the letters rustled with the movement, a lifetime of secrets waiting to be read. And in his chest, something shifted, an ache that had long lived in silence now stirred by purpose. This wasn't over. The past never stayed buried for long. But now, for the first time in years, Jack felt like he had a reason to keep digging. By the time Jack returned to the ranch, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long golden shadows across the land, painting the barn and fences in warm amber light. His limp was noticeable, though he tried not to favor the leg. It throbbed beneath the denim, a steady reminder of the cabin floor that had collapsed beneath him. A jagged scrape marked his shin, the skin torn and bruised, but nothing serious. He'd had far worse, injuries with names and dates and medals that meant nothing back home. This wound, though, felt different, not because it hurt more, but because of what it had cost him to earn it. It wasn't pain that lingered, it was purpose. Solace followed him all the way back, never once needing to be tethered or led. The Mustang had simply walked beside him, step for step, as if understanding that whatever Jack had retrieved from that place mattered more than either of them could explain. And it did. Jack could feel it pressing against his back, a quiet weight inside the pack slung over his shoulder. Inside were decades-old letters and legal documents, ink faded and edges brittle, but each one pulsing with unresolved tension. There were words that had never been spoken, regrets that had never been voiced, and now they were in his hands. Back at the barn, Jack unlatched the gate and let Solace wander freely. The horse didn't bolt. It never did. Instead, it walked a slow arc around the pasture before settling near the same tree it had rested under before, tail swishing lazily, eyes always watching. Jack gave his saddle horse a rub-down, tossed hay into the trough, then made his way to the porch, collapsing onto the top step with a groan. The pain in his leg flared again as he sat, but he ignored it, pulling the pack around and unzipping it carefully. He laid the letters out beside him, one by one, smoothing the creases with deliberate care. The sun caught the edge of the paper, lighting it like stained glass. The first envelope was addressed to Mother and Father, written in a neat, slanted hand, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone raised with formal education and stricter expectations. Jack didn't open it right away. He let his fingers run over the date, June 1973, then over the signature. Thomas Whitmore, Sage's father. So, it was true. The cabin hadn't just been a remnant of a family he once left behind. It had been his starting point, his birthplace, and whatever had driven him to abandon it had festered in silence for decades. Jack read for hours, the light fading around him, the stars bleeding into the sky above as the night settled in. The letters were personal, some filled with bitter frustration, others with deep sorrow. One recounted a land dispute that split the family apart, something about livestock rights, inheritance laws, and a betrayal between brothers. Another revealed the slow disintegration of trust between Thomas and his father, a man described as proud, rigid, unbending. Thomas had written of long nights sleeping in the barn, of arguments that turned into silences, of the day he finally drove off and never looked back. It wasn't one moment that fractured the Whitmore family. It was a slow erosion, and these letters were the record of that decay. The most gutting of them all was the torn one, scrawled in a rush, the handwriting uneven. It was the last note Thomas ever wrote to his parents. "I'm sorry," it began. "I never meant for it to happen like this." The rest was damaged, the paper soaked at some point and dried stiff. Only a few scattered words were readable. The deed. Not enough time. She doesn't know. Jack stared at those fragments for a long time, piecing together possibilities, theories, assumptions. He wondered what she didn't know. He wondered if that she was Sage, or her mother, or maybe even someone else entirely. That night, Jack couldn't sleep again. The moon rose high over the fields, casting silver light across the land, and still he sat there, letters beside him, a slow storm building behind his eyes. His thoughts spun. The cabin hadn't just been the setting for a rescue, it had been the vault for an entire legacy, one that someone, maybe more than one person, had tried very hard to forget. But time doesn't let go of the things we bury. It just waits, patient and still, until someone comes along with the courage or the recklessness to dig them up. In the morning, he called the hospital and asked for Sage. The nurse passed the phone along. Her voice was stronger than before. "Hey," she said, "you okay?" "I've got something," Jack replied, already pacing the porch. "You're going to want to see it for yourself." He didn't go into detail over the phone. Not yet. Some things needed to be shown, not told. They arranged for her to visit in a few days, the doctors agreeing to an early discharge under the condition that she took it easy. Jack promised he'd handle the logistics, that he'd be there to help with everything. Sage didn't protest. Maybe she was too curious. Maybe, deep down, she knew what was coming. When he hung up, Solace approached the porch again, walking straight to him with that calm, assessing gaze. Jack ran a hand down the horse's neck, his voice low. "We're not done, are we?" The horse didn't flinch, didn't turn away, and Jack, in that moment, felt a strange sense of reassurance. This wasn't just a random rescue. This wasn't just about a girl in a locked room. The cabin, the letters, the legacy. It was all connected, and now it was up to them to piece it together. The past wasn't dead. It was waiting, and Jack Brennan had just picked up the first key. Sage arrived at the ranch 4 days later, stepping out of Jack's old pickup with a cautious grace that came from healing bones and unfinished thoughts. She wore a worn denim jacket 2 sizes too big, likely borrowed from the hospital's donation bin, and clutched a leather satchel to her chest like it contained something precious. Her face was still pale, her features sharp with recovery, but her eyes burned with quiet fire, the fire of someone who had come close to the edge of something dark and made the deliberate choice to come back, not just to survive, but to understand. Jack watched her step onto the gravel drive, her boots crunching against the stones, and he felt the subtle shift in the air, as if something dormant had stirred and now watched from the trees. He offered her a hand. She took it, fingers cool but steady. "Long drive?" he asked, not really knowing what else to say. She gave a faint smile, more real than the ones she wore at the hospital. "Not long enough," she replied. "I've been thinking about this place since the moment I left it." Jack led her into the house, where he'd laid the letters across the old dining room table, organized by date. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, lighting up the edges of the paper like halos. Sage paused at the threshold, staring at the yellowed pages like they were ghosts resurrected from her family's past. She stepped forward slowly, hands trembling as she reached for the one addressed to Mother and Father. Her lips parted when she read the date. "I wasn't born yet," she whispered. "He wrote this before I ever existed." She sat down, eyes scanning line after line, her breath catching as she absorbed each sentence. Jack watched her carefully. He didn't interrupt. He just stood nearby, arms crossed, feeling like a sentry guarding something fragile. She read every letter, some with tears in her eyes, others with a flat expression, like the truths they revealed had been waiting in her DNA all along. After nearly an hour, she looked up at him. "He was running," she said quietly. "Not just from them, but from something he did, something he thought he couldn't undo." Jack nodded. "The torn letter. He says I never meant for it to happen like this. You think it was about the family fight?" Sage shook her head slowly. "Maybe part of it, but I think there's more. Something missing." She picked up the damaged page, examining the water stains, the jagged edge. "He mentioned a deed, something about not enough time, and that she doesn't know. If that she was my mom, maybe it means he kept the truth from both of us." Jack leaned forward, pointing to a detail he'd noticed earlier. "This one here from the law firm. It references a transfer of land ownership, the Whitmore Ranch. But there's a clause about a second property line, a portion that was never formally divided. It could be that someone else claimed it illegally, or my dad gave it away without telling anyone," Sage finished. "That could be what started the feud." They sat in silence for a few moments, the air thick with revelations. Outside, Solace wandered past the window, a blur of movement against the backdrop of tall grass and morning light. Jack glanced toward the horse, then back at Sage. "I want to show you something." They returned to the cabin that afternoon, Jack driving slow along the trail that wound through the trees like a path etched in memory. Solace followed again, unbothered by the pace, sometimes trotting ahead, sometimes falling behind, always present. When they reached the clearing, Sage stepped out of the truck and looked at the cabin with fresh eyes, her breath caught. "It feels different now." Jack said nothing. He simply handed her the flashlight and followed as she crossed the grass. The cabin creaked as they entered, but it no longer held the same menace. It felt abandoned, yes, but not malevolent. It was a place waiting to be reclaimed. Sage moved through the space slowly, pausing in the room where she'd nearly died. She ran her fingers along the cracked wall, then turned back to Jack. "I want to fix this." "You don't have to," he said. "We can board it up. Let it go." She shook her head. "Number, I don't want this place to be the end of the story. I want it to be a turning point." They spent the rest of the afternoon clearing debris, pulling up rotted boards and tossing them into a growing pile outside. Jack worked silently, driven by muscle memory and a sense of duty. Sage, though slower, didn't stop. She moved with deliberate purpose, as if each swing of the hammer, each board removed, was a small act of reclamation. Solace stood nearby the entire time, watching them work. When they paused, the Mustang approached, nudging Sage's shoulder gently. She reached up to touch its face, her voice soft. "You saved me. I haven't forgotten." Jack watched the interaction, struck again by how natural it all felt. Like they were three pieces of a story that had been waiting to collide. Man, woman, and horse. None of them whole on their own. All of them scarred by pasts they didn't ask for. But here they were, building something out of ruin. By dusk, the front room of the cabin was stripped clean. The walls, though weathered, stood solid. The floor would need replacing. The roof needed bracing. But the bones were good. Jack stood in the doorway, arms aching, sweat soaking through his shirt, and looked out at the clearing. The golden light made the grass shimmer like a sea. Sage came to stand beside him, brushing dust from her jeans. "You know," she said quietly, "my dad always told me that the past is a weight you carry, not a place you go. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe you have to go back, just once, to make peace with it." Jack nodded. Sometimes going back is the only way forward. They left as twilight fell, Solace trotting ahead, the trail now so familiar it no longer felt wild. And as they drove home in silence, the stars appearing one by one above the trees, Jack realized something he hadn't dared admit out loud. This wasn't just Sage's story anymore. It was his too. And he wasn't just helping her find closure. He was finding it too, buried in the past, yes, but now within reach. The path wasn't clear. There were more questions than answers, but they were finally asking them together, and that somehow made all the difference. Winter came in quiet stages, not with blizzards or violent winds, but with the slow hush of falling leaves, the long breath of the prairie settling under frost, and the way the horses' coats grew thicker with the promise of cold. Life at the ranch had slipped into a rhythm that neither Jack nor Sage had expected, one built on quiet mornings and long afternoons, on the creak of wood and the scrape of nails, and on the slow reconstruction of a cabin that had once nearly taken everything from her. They didn't speak often about the night Sage was found, not directly, but the weight of it was always there. Between hammer swings and fence mending, beneath the shared silences that came over morning coffee or late-night walks along the fence line. What needed to be said had been said with hands, with work, with presence, and that was enough. The letters had become a touchstone. They were kept in a wooden box now, refinished and placed on the mantel of the cabin's newly rebuilt hearth, a symbol of both history and healing. Sage read through them like scripture, copying each one into a leather-bound journal by hand, even the damaged ones. She didn't want to scan them or take photos. She needed to feel the paper beneath her fingers, to write the words herself, to engage with them in the slow, deliberate way you might tend a wound. Jack had taken to writing too, though in a different form. A notebook once used by his father, nothing fancy, just a hard-bound ledger with faded lines, had become his own confessional. Each night he sat by the firelight, jotting down memories, his father teaching him to ride, the way Everett used to hum while cleaning tack, the first time they rebuilt a fence post together, their hands both raw from splinters and sun. He didn't romanticize the man. He didn't need to. But in every line he wrote, Jack felt a piece of his own story begin to settle into place. Solace, as always, remained their silent companion. The horse had grown even more familiar around the ranch, often standing close by while they worked, nuzzling tools or peering curiously into the cabin's open windows. At night, it patrolled the property's edge like a guardian spirit, its breath misting in the cold, its ears always pricked to some faraway sound. Children from town had started calling it the miracle horse, whispering about how it had saved a woman from a haunted cabin and led a soldier through the woods like something out of legend. Sage would laugh at the stories but never correct them. She said the truth was stranger anyway, Word of what they'd done spread slowly but steadily. Neighbors began dropping by, offering scraps of lumber, old nails, or spare time to help with repairs. Some came just to see the place. Others brought memories, faded photos, hand-drawn maps, stories from their grandparents about the Whitmore family and the once proud ranch that had crumbled with silence and bitterness. Slowly, the cabin was no longer a relic. It became a living place again, breathing through new wood and polished windows, holding warmth in its walls like it hadn't in decades. They decided to name it Whitmore's Haven. Sage carved the sign herself. It wasn't perfect. The edges weren't even, and one letter was a little off-center, but Jack swore it was the most beautiful piece of woodwork he'd ever seen. They nailed it above the front door on a bright afternoon, while the snow melted in shallow puddles across the yard. That night, they stood beneath it, watching as the wind rustled the trees and the stars blinked to life one by one. "I don't know if I'll ever really understand why he left," Sage said quietly, her arms crossed against the chill. "But I think I've forgiven him for it." Jack didn't answer right away. He just nodded, then said, "Sometimes you find peace not by knowing the whole truth, but by knowing enough to let go." Sage reached down, her hand brushing his. "Thank you," she said, "for not walking away, for going back when you didn't have to." He smiled, a quiet thing that curled just at the corners of his mouth. "I think we both went back for a reason." And maybe they had. Maybe the past had needed witnesses. Maybe the cabin had waited not for Sage or Jack individually, but for both. Two people broken in different ways, drawn together by a Mustang who refused to stay silent, a horse that had appeared on a cold autumn day and stared into Jack's soul like it knew exactly what he was running from. As weeks passed, Sage began drafting plans. She wanted the cabin to be more than just a preserved site. She envisioned it as a retreat, a quiet place for people seeking to reconnect with the land, with family, with themselves. She spoke of workshops, journaling retreats, even equine therapy. Jack wasn't much for big ideas, but he listened. And every time she sketched something new, he'd nod and offer, "We could build that." Their bond deepened in ways that didn't need labels. They worked in sync, moved together like people who'd known each other longer than they had. In the late evenings, when the fire was low and the wind rattled the windows, they'd sit in comfortable silence, sipping coffee, trading stories about their fathers. Grief, they found, didn't need fixing. It needed space, and they had found that space in each other. One night, just before the year turned, Jack woke from a restless dream, memories of war, of sand and fire, and the hollow boom of things falling apart. He sat up, breath fast, chest tight. But he wasn't alone. From the open window, the quiet snort of solace reached him, and then, padding softly down the hallway, came the creak of floorboards. Sage, barefoot and half asleep, stepped into the room. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She just handed him a blanket and sat beside him on the edge of the bed. For a while they said nothing. Then Jack whispered, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the horse hadn't shown up?" Sage smiled through the dim light. "Sometimes," she said, "but then I remember it did show up, and we're here." And that was enough. By spring, the cabin was fully restored. Visitors came in small numbers, neighbors, curious locals, a few from out of town who'd heard the story in scattered online forums. But it never became crowded. It wasn't about tourism. It was about healing, about standing in a place once filled with pain and feeling the warmth of a fire built with new hands. Solace still roamed freely, a living legend among them. Children drew pictures of the Mustang and taped them to the cabin walls. Guests left notes in a small tin box by the door, messages of gratitude, questions for the past, prayers for the future. And one morning, as Jack watched the sunrise from the porch, Sage joined him with 2 mugs in hand. She passed him one, and they sat there side by side, shoulders brushing. "No matter what comes next," she said, voice soft, "this will always be the place where I found my way back." Jack looked out over the land, the rising sun catching in Solace's mane as the horse stood at the edge of the field, still watching, always watching. He nodded slowly, eyes full of quiet certainty. "Yeah," he said, "and maybe it's where I finally stopped running." They didn't need to say more. Some stories begin in silence, others end there too.